welcome back to our video tutorial series on how to use GreenScenario. In this episode, we're going to look at how we can automate some tasks that can become mundane while working with more complex projects. So one of the examples over here is, what if we wanted to place 4 buildings in the model and then have individual control over these buildings. So right now, these 4 curves, they are connected to this one building component, and then we can control them over here. But if we wanted to have individual control over these, what we would need to do in a traditional way, we would need to copy this building component over 4 times and then reference these curves individually. So we would do something like this maybe. Set one curve, and one more time over here. And then we would connect all these curves to our scenario. And now we can then just say we have individual control over, for example, roof types and whatnot. But this, you can imagine, if you're working with more complex models, this can become difficult for you to understand, all this spaghetti that we're creating, and especially if we're only talking about one scenario over here. If we're talking multiple scenarios and there will be changes across scenarios, you would have to copy over the entire node structure, the entire network, and then it's very, very easy to lose overview of what's going on. So the alternative approach to that would be to only work with one node, and then each of the geometry components, when you right-click on them, you can activate the so-called developer mode. And what it does is it creates this additional input for us over here, override, and you can immediately see also the geometry disappeared. So under utilities, there's another component called GS automation parameters. So if you put it over here, and then you can see override connects to override, and then under its options, we can see these overrides here are different for individual components. So depending on which one we're working with, there's only a few or maybe more options to override over here. So make sure to choose the one that's corresponding to the geometry component that you're working with. Now that we have that done, the first step to do would be to actually reference all four curves into this one component. So we'll do it like this and make sure that I had selected all of them. And now we just need to look at what the override component actually provides us with. So if you look closer, it allows us to programmatically change the inputs for all the possible inputs that our geometry components have. So building type corresponds to this drop-down menu over here, levels to this number slider over here, and so on and so forth. And how would we go about that? We would just create lists, and we just literally type this over here. So let's say we want to create only residential buildings, and I would type the name residential, and then I would connect it to the building type. And then first thing that happened, you can see that we have generated 4 residential buildings, and now we can have individual control over their levels. So let's do this. Let's create a panel, and then let's say we just start with one input, and when we double click on that, we will just say 1, 2, 3, and 4, or 4 over here. Okay, and then we need to convert this type to multi-line data. So I just right-clicked and I have multi-line data, and I connect this to levels. Right now, not much has happened, and the reason for that is twofold. First of all, we need to, when we look at what is the output from our override component, is we see that we're still only generating one output, and it has 1 levels. So it translates to all of these. The reason for that is that we have only one input to the building type. So what we can do is we either manually go into this list and then copy it over 4 times to say for 4 of these buildings, we have now created 4 individual entries. And you can see the building type is residential, and then the 0th element in the list has levels number 1, levels number 2, and so on. And right now, why isn't it displaying over here is because of how Grasshopper understands inputs coming in. And you can see these wires over here, they have this dashed line that's fake, and it means that it's coming as a tree structure. So the data is grouped under these little numbers over here. So here this is the 0th element first and so on. But what's coming here as curves, they are just coming as one list. So we can tell that just by looking at the wire. So if we just right click on the curves component over here and say graphed, it creates this grafted output. And then now if we look at the curves, we'll also see that they come as 0, 1, 2, 3. So this is great, but we still are not seeing the expected results over here. And this is because our scenarios have to be flattened to back to this normal wire. So what we just need to do here is just right click on the output and then flatten this one. And this way we have one component that is that allows us to have individual control over multiple instances of this particular building component. And this applies to everything. So for example, if we want to change the roof type, we can see what are the inputs here. And then by default, it populates. So again, if I just connect the panel over here, and we'll have a look at what's being sped out from the component, we can see that by default, the roof type is of conventional type, and facade is also conventional. And this corresponds to the default entry in this drop-down list. But what if we wanted to say that, for example, 2 of these buildings should have green extensive facades, roof types? Then we would do exactly that. We would take a list and we would say, let's say the first one, we want to have conventional, and then we need green extensive, and we copied this one over here, and this we can just leave out and as a default. So I'll just make it a little bit easier for you to read like this, and then we connect this input to our roof types, and you can see immediately we have created these additional roofs. And this would be true for any of the components over here, that we can just as a proof of concept, we can take our green areas component, and if we right click and say developer mode, we can then say our overrides, change this to green area, override to override, and then here we have only 3 parameters that we can play with, but still we can generate multiple instances of a component. And remember always to make sure that you're grafting the input curves or points in case if you're working with points, and that you're flattening the output from the component to make sure that the scenarios are being generated in a correct way. One tip over here is if you want to avoid manually typing, if for example all of your buildings are of one type or all of your green areas are of the same type, and you don't want to manually copy over these names, what you can do is you can use the duplicate data component. And the way it works is that you would just create one entry, residential, and you would say this is my data input, and then you would say how many times do I want to duplicate that. So in this case I would just like to duplicate it 4 times because this is how many entries we have, and then we can just plug it in here and we'll have exactly the same effect, because you can see here if let's just change the number, it will break the component, but just to show you, if we want 8 entries, it will generate 8 of these entries for us over here. So this is an easy way to automate some of the tasks and keep the canvas relatively easy to navigate while still having ultimate flexibility with generating different geometry types. And to make things easier for you, I have prepared a template over here. So again, if we look at the template component under options, we have already exported default setup and materials, but there's also a template for automation. So if we click on generate, you can see that, well, this portion of the template is exactly the same, but what happens to the left of the scenario input is that all of these components have already pre-selected developer mode, and they're connected with the correct override option set. And then right now you can just generate your automation networks in a fairly straightforward way.